Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar from Union Learn about mental health challenges beyond COVID-19. I'm Anna from the TUC, and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Annie Robinson and James Withy, and we'll be hearing from them in a minute. But just a little bit of housekeeping first. I'm sure many of you are return webinar viewers, so you'll know all this, but if anyone that's new, we've got a chat panel on the right-hand side of the screen. Great to see that really busy already, but please use that to chat to each other and to share any tips and ideas that you might have. If you've got any questions for Annie and James, there's an Ask a Question button below us. You can post your questions there, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can after the main bit of the webinar. We are recording this, so if you miss anything, don't worry, you can watch the recording afterwards. And my colleagues from Union Learn are busy in the chat posting links and resources and any other tips that you might find useful. Any of you, I could just see a couple of messages. One person's got no sound, and another person's got an echo. If you've got an echo, make sure you've not got the webinar open in more than one window, because that might be causing your echo. If you have any sound problems, just try refreshing your screen. That should sort it out. So refreshing, and make sure you've not got two windows open. Okay, let's hand over to our panelists just to introduce themselves. So James, can you just introduce yourself first, please?
Yeah, of course. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. So yeah, I'm James. I'm the author of a book that's just come out called How to Tell Depression to Pissed Off. And I'm the editor of the Recovery Letters book, which is a reading well book with the reading agency. I'm a former counsellor and trainer, and I live with depression as well.
Thanks, James. Annie, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Robinson. I work at the Reading Agency, which is a UK-wide reading charity. I'm the programme manager for Reading and Health. So we deliver a scheme called Reading Well that is a kind of books on prescription but bibliotherapy scheme to support mental health and wellbeing, which includes the Recovery Letters, one of James's amazing books.
Thanks. So before we get going with some questions for you, can you just explain briefly, so we'll stick with you first, Annie, and then go back to James, the importance of mental health over the past 4 months? I think we can all agree it's been a very unusual time. So it will be really good to hear why this is so important.
I think, you know, mental health is increasingly, like, people are aware that it's something that we all need to be in touch with, that it affects us throughout our lives, when we're healthy, when we experience challenges, when we experience mental health conditions, or the people in our lives do. And I think, you know, there's been a huge increase in awareness of that, and I think this period has really shown a lot of people that that you know, that external factors can impact your mental health so much as well, and hopefully has kind of given people a real insight into the importance of maintaining and exploring their mental health needs.
Thanks, Annie. So James, why can you summarise why you think mental health has been particularly important over the past 4 months?
You know, I think it's because our world has turned completely upside down, and for some people who've lost loved ones, then, you know, even more. But we're suddenly in a world that we kind of no longer recognise, and we're sort of starting to come out of that. But it's been 4 months of where everything that we knew has completely altered. And so that has massive impact on our mental health. So our routines have changed, our relationships have changed, you know, everything has altered. So there's no way that enormous change will not have an effect on our mental health, whether you have a pre-existing mental health condition or not. In fact, a lot of people that I've been speaking to, you know, have suddenly been experiencing anxiety when they've never had anxiety before, or depression when they've never experienced periods of depression before. And of course, you know, it's like, of course we would, because the world has changed radically. and our lives have changed radically, even to, you know, tiny little elements that we got used to. So we got used to be able to buy things in the supermarket, and then suddenly not be able to do that is a massive, enormous shock. So the shock factor of this is huge. So, you know, it's no wonder that we're all struggling.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think we can all agree that it has been an incredibly unusual few months, hasn't it? And it's no wonder that we're all feeling the effects of it. Okay, so I've got some questions for you both. To start off, what are the biggest challenges we face post-lockdown in relation to our mental health? Let's start with you, Annie.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because obviously lockdown is such a specifically unique experience that none of us have really faced before, and coming out of it is the same. But when we think about you know, in terms of mental health challenges, the things that people really are facing are the same things that affect our mental health all the time. And what's kind of positive about that to some extent is that there's a lot of resources there to support you. So things like anxiety and depression, as James has mentioned, things like loneliness and isolation, bereavement, uncertainty, precarious employment. These have always been things that have a huge impact on our mental health, and that's gone into kind of overdrive at the moment. But what's positive about the familiarity of those in a way is that there are a lot of resources available to support people. For the Reading Well book collections, these are all key topics that we cover, and that you know, people like have engaged in a lot. So there are a lot of resources, whether it's kind of in your library, whether it's through signposting, whether it's through charities or the health sector, for all of these key things. And I think it's like, hopefully there are things that people will engage with, and not just because like this is a really like strange and unique experience, feel like that there's nothing there that can support them, because there are a lot of great resources out there that hopefully people will be signposted to and access.
Thanks, Annie. Same question to you, James. What are the biggest challenges we face in this new post-lockdown world?
So certainly feelings of anxiety. So absolutely. So certainly, you know, going to pubs when they are in a completely different format, going to shops with masks on, you know, just going out in public. So in some ways we got used to, in lockdown, a certain kind of routine of we just went out once a day, and there was a certain sort of safety in that because we knew where we were. And now that rules are changing on a really, really regular basis, it's almost impossible to keep up with what you can and can't do. And that can provoke anxiety. It's like, can I do that? Can I go and see this person? Who am I bubbling with? It's very confusing, you know, and things are changing rapidly all the time. So, you know, I think one of the big things is that we are going to be experiencing anxiety about what we can and can't do, and when we go outside. Also, this experience has felt like a bereavement, as I was saying earlier. There's been a huge loss of our lives that were. So, you know, we're kind of mourning for kind of life that we used to have, you know. So feelings of sadness are kind of really, really common in the moment, which is, oh, I used to be able to just go on holiday. I used to be able to just not have to think about where I could drive. So, you know, anxiety, sadness, absolutely are going to be challenges that are really up there. I think also that feeling of well, should I have done something in lockdown? Should I have written my novel, or, you know, taken the kids kite surfing, or should I have done these things? And it's like, no, absolutely not. It's, you know, just surviving is achieving. You know, having got through this and still going through this is enough. You know, that is absolutely enough. I think the other challenge is expect to be tired. You know, expect to be exhausted. So this is a tiring process when there are new regulations in place and things are different. That's a lot of information to take in. So if you're not feeling tired, you know, what's going on? Because I'm exhausted. So, you know, expect to be going outside and maybe going back to work and going back to do things, but expect to be tired and take that into account and look after yourself as because of that.
Thanks, James. I think that's a really important point about looking after yourself. I'm going to pose the next question to Annie in a second, but we are there is a little bit of static coming from when you speak, so I'm going to try and reset that. It means that you'll disappear for a minute, but you'll come back again, and while we're doing that, I'll pose the next question to Annie, so don't worry, you will be back. Okay, so while we're sorting out that sound issue, next question for you, Annie, is what do you have your top 3 tips for managing day-to-day life after lockdown? Because as you've both just mentioned, things are changing, and they're changing in a maybe haphazard way. No one's really sure what we're allowed to do, but what are your top 3 tips for managing daily life now?
I think these will obviously be like personal to different people. I think something that's my number one thing, I think it's really important to take time for self-care, and that can look like anything. Like, I think there's this assumption now that self-care is like taking a bubble bath or something, but like this could be anything, and it could be like finding out more information about how you're thinking and feeling. It could just be like, for me, I work at a reading charity, it's reading. So like taking some time, maybe like away from the news cycle, if that's stressing you out, away from technology, if you're finding that difficult, away from like trying to set a kind of time limit to not think about, or to try and focus on something that might not be causing you anxieties. And something like reading, I think, works really well, because, you know, if you don't feel up for reading much, you could take a poem, you could take an audiobook, you could take a short story for like, you know, 5 to 10 minutes and try and concentrate on something else. If that's not for you, it might be walking, it might be listening to some music, it might be sitting outside if the weather allows. So I think self-care in all forms, in a way that works for you, is the most important thing. The second thing I would say is to kind of pace yourself. I think there's this feeling that as soon as something's kind of allowed, or as soon as there's a development in stage, that suddenly becomes the acceptable thing that everyone should be doing. But you know, you just can only work at a pace that works for you. So if you're being asked to go to a restaurant and you don't feel like that's a trigger point for anxiety for you, then just work at a pace that makes sense for yourself, and not kind of rush things. And I think there's an importance in understanding that through this period, like, everyone has their own kind of internal logic about what makes sense. Like, some people have been very, very, might be very concerned about maintaining 2 meters distance, but like, you know, that haven't been as but have, you know, like possibly not socially distanced as much. And I think there's just an idea that obviously like keeping within the rules, and also like doing things that make sense to you at a pace that makes sense to you, but also just understanding that other people, their internal logic might be a little bit different to yours, and just kind of accepting that it doesn't have to make sense to you as long as you're kind of doing what makes sense to you, and you're, you know, like not breaking any laws. And then the third thing I think on that theme is just kind of talking, because if, like, I think there's a lot of stress and anxiety bubble up around misunderstandings of each other, or not feeling able to share your anxieties about something, potentially to make someone else more anxious. And I think just like taking the time to explain how you're feeling, why you might be feeling a certain way, sometimes even just to yourself, can really like help you feel more in touch with your feelings, and help you feel like you can take ownership of them. And even if that means that you're going to do something that makes you anxious, but you want to take that next step and you've kind of decided to do it, then you might feel more positively about that if you're kind of able to talk about it before. And if you're able to hear from other people how they're feeling, it can kind of make you realize that we're all experiencing a lot of similar things, and kind of like we're sort of in it together as much as is possible. But yeah, I think that would be my top 3.
Thanks, Annie, and welcome back, James. So same question for you. I'll repeat it because I kicked you out when I said it's for Annie. What are your top 3 tips for managing day-to-day life after lockdown?
So yeah, certainly my kind of number one is have things to look forward to on almost on a daily basis. So there are so many things that have been taken away from us. So kind of theatre and sport and cinema and so many things that we can't do. So things like I was really looking forward to the Great British Bake Off. That's great for my mental health. It's fantastic. I would love to watch that, and kind of that's gone. And so you've got to build in things that you're really looking forward to. So I mean, I do really, on the surface of it, sort of stupid things like I'll buy myself a really nice yogurt, and I'll really look forward to that yogurt on a daily basis because it's a really great yogurt, and I'll do that. So you've got to have something nice. And not all of us can go on holiday or are anxious about going on holiday. So the things that we had to look forward to are massively restricted or have gone. So you've got to build those in some way into your life, weekly or daily. You need stuff to look forward to. That's really, really, really important. So, if you're spending less on travel, maybe, then treat yourself to something, treat yourself to a book or treat yourself to whatever it might be. Having those treats is really important. The other thing I would say is kind of write down the moments of joy that you're having. So, and build those as a list. So what we're seeing at the moment is, lots and lots and lots of news about death and about really terrible things happening. So you need to notice the happiness and joy in your life. Are people still having problems with sound? That's not good. I'm sorry about that. I'm not quite sure why. What I do is I write down on my phone things that I've experienced that have been really joyful. So, I'll witness like a dog with a really big stick, or, I'll witness somebody having a massive ice cream, which they love. So, and I'll write those things down to refer back to, because we need to have joy in our lives. The other thing I think is really important is kind of what Annie was saying, which is you don't need to do things that other people are doing. You can pace yourself and do what feels right. So it's kind of like you don't need to be flying off to Spain and other things. You just have to manage what's within your control. So if it doesn't feel right to go on holiday, then that's okay. That's absolutely fine. Do what feels right for you and go at a pace that's right for you as well.
Thanks, James. You'll notice I've switched your camera off temporarily because I think it marginally helps with the sound. You're obviously still there, still hear you, and I'll bring you back. But I think for now, it does help a little bit with the interference.
It's fine. You don't need to see my face. It's probably best.
I will bring you back. Don't worry. Okay. That's some really great tips there from both of you. And I think what's also really helpful is there's lots of information and resources being shared in the chat panel, and from both the Mental Health Foundation, from the NHS, and from an organisation called No Panic. So do be sure to check all of those out. So I've got another question for you both. Just one moment. So question 3, what examples have you got of ways to manage any mental health challenges we might face as we come out of lockdown? So we've covered some of this already, but then what top tips, but what specific ways have you got to manage mental health? So Annie, let's go with you first.
I think, one of the huge changes that we've all experienced is in our workplaces, right? Like if we're going into them physically, if we're working from home, something that I found useful personally is Mind offer employee wellbeing action plans. So you can and it sort of asks questions like, what do I need to know to work well with you that you can do with your colleagues, to kind of make sure that you're treating everyone in this kind of new difficult situation in a way that makes sense for them, it makes sense for your communication. We created internally a kind of list of best practice working from home tips, because with the understanding that like some people have caring responsibilities in the home, and certain times are better for them, if possible, for a video call. So if you're aware of that, you can kind of make those adjustments to try and just make sure everyone's being as kind and kind of generous to each other as possible. Because I think a lot of the things that we can do to make tangible changes to make sure our mental health is better protected is by like making sure those communities around us are being responsive to our needs. So that might be your workplace, it might be your union, it might be your family, your friends, it could be like a mutual aid group that's sprung up in your area, it could be your public library, where you can not only access reading well books, but also access loads of signposting for loads of like important things that might be affecting your mental health, whether it's unemployment, whether it's like precarious housing situations, whether it's just anxiety and depression. Finding somewhere that you can go and making sure that community is taking things seriously and thinking every day about what could be negatively impacting your mental health, and what like, even if it's small changes, what could be implemented to make sure that you're being like cared, that your situation is kind of as safe as possible. As well as that, I would just say, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of us have become more conscious of our physical health. We're keeping track of symptoms in a way that we haven't been before. And yes, a lot of that is causing anxiety. But there is something to be said about keeping track of our symptoms of our mental health. If you find that you're not sleeping as well as you used to be, you know, being aware of that, trying to tweak something about your sleep hygiene, taking technology out of your room, setting a specific bedtime, just like small, like responding to small triggers in the same way as we would for our kind of like physical health triggers, to sort of take the temperature of your mental health, as it were. And I think, yeah, just kind of continuing to talk, whether it's to your employer or friends and family or someone else in another community that you're a part of, and continuing to listen as well when other people talk to you, I think.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So James, you're still with us. Thanks, Annie, for that. So the same question for you. What are examples of ways that we can manage any mental health challenges we might face as we come out of lockdown? Over to you, James.
So yeah, I think definitely keep a list of mental health, you know, services numbers, so helpline numbers. So, and keep those in your phone, or just keep a list somewhere. You know, it's like those helplines are there waiting for your call. That is what they do. So I know sometimes there's a tendency to go, oh, those aren't for me. They absolutely are. So you've obviously got places like the Samaritans, and that doesn't need to be, you know, sometimes we just associate the Samaritans with suicide, but that's not the case at all. You can phone the Samaritans for any kind of emotional support at all. You've also got a text-based one that I always find it easier to text than talk, and that's called Shout. And that was the charity set up by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. And what's good about that is that you can text rather than talk. So sometimes it's really difficult to talk, but you might be able to send a text, and actually in many ways we're more used to sending text. So that's a good one. You've also got Calm, which is for the campaign against living miserably, and they've got a message-based service as well as a helpline. Also, kind of local mental health teams have, you know, certainly mine and loads of others have increased their hours. So they've increased it to 24/7, which is fantastic. So you can check your local mental health line. So where I live in Sussex, there's a Sussex mental health line, and they've gone 24/7. I don't think not everybody has, but a lot of people have. But keep those numbers to hand, but please remember that those numbers are there for you. Often with mental health, we think that's not for me, that's for people with something more serious. They're absolutely not. They are designed for you. And you've also got your employment support schemes as well. But all those charities are, I need you to imagine them waiting for your call, because that's what they're there to do. So yeah, then on the text number for shout has just come up in the chat, which is really good, which is really fantastic. I think also when things get difficult and there's so much that is out of control in our world just now, let's try and almost pin something down that is within your control. So we've got so much out of control. So we've got things like, government making decisions, and we can't control the virus, and we can't control lots of things. So try and do things that are within your control, even really small things like doing the washing or taking the dog out. You've got to balance how upside down the world is with the things that are within your control. So, make a decision about some food that you're going to buy, or do something that you can have control over. And that's really, really important, because it sort of brings back a sense of, oh, there isn't, everything isn't out of control. I do have control over some things. I can choose to go for a walk here. I can choose to go to that shop. I can choose to do things. And that really helps, I think. The other thing that I was going to talk about, which I think came up in the chat as well, is that doing something to help others. That sort of feelings of that being altruistic really helps our mental health. So it gives us a sense of self-worth because we're doing something useful, and it gives us some meaningful activity, and that's really important. So if you want to volunteer in some way, or you want to help out a neighbour, still continue to do that. That really helps our mental health. It makes us feel meaningful, it makes us feel worthy, and at the same time, it's helping people out. So yeah, just kind of in summary, so keep those helplines to hand, in your phone, and don't hesitate to phone them. Also, you might get somebody on those phone lines that you don't get on with so well. That's absolutely fine. Please don't dismiss that particular phone line just because somebody you haven't got particularly well with. Try again, because they're just individual people also, and there's lots of them, so you can try again. So yeah, cycle one was about hanging on to things that are within your control, and then doing something meaningful to help others too.
Thanks for that, James. I think we've had some really useful suggestions there. We're going to look and see if we can answer some of the questions that you've been posting. So, right, let me just see what we've got here. Okay. So I'm assuming this maybe has been posted by a workplace rep or a union learning rep. And the question is, what can we do to help employers understand, hang on, the question's just disappeared. What can we do to help employers understand issues that may come with returning to the office or the workplace? Some people have settled quite well and quite quickly into the new way of living and working, and are anxious about having to go back. So let's start with you, Annie.
Well, I think, in order to open a workplace, all employers, they're having to do a physical risk assessment to ensure that the place is safe for work. And there's no reason why mental health is not part of that risk assessment, because if you're sending people back to, or should not be part of that risk assessment, because if you're sending people back to a situation that could trigger their anxiety, regardless of what the safety situations are, that's a very real issue that employers really need to be aware of. So I would suggest asking your employers to do a risk assessment for mental health. I know I mentioned them before, but I do think the well-being action plans, doing them with your employer, can be really, really useful. And yeah, if there are, I think a few people in the chat have mentioned mental health first aiders. If that's something that's available to you in your workplace, making kind of asking if that could be brought in as well, if it isn't, because people are very likely to be anxious going back in. it's not even just for safety concerns, it's a huge shift it's a lot of disruption. So I think just like trying to ensure that there's been as much kind of like there's been care and thought around risk assessments for mental health as well as physical health is just a really important pressure to apply to workplaces at the moment.
Thanks, Annie. And the TUC does have a lot of information and advice about risk assessments and how union reps can work with their employer on these. Obviously, risk assessments are the employer's responsibility, but there is information about that on the TUC website. So, James, same question for you about people returning to work and that they're perhaps anxious about doing that because they've settled well into the new way of working and living.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, if interference gets bad, I can type my answer if that's easier. So let me know if that's not going well. I think.
Oh, you still there?
Good stuff. I think that you're. Yep, still here. I think the relationships with your colleagues is really important, and I think when you go back to work, I think actually trying to find times, if you can, to meet up and chat about what lockdown life has been like and how's it been like at work is really important. Now, if you can get your employer to build that into the day, that would be fantastic. So I know at my workplace, we're doing like a morning meeting, and it's just a chance to kind of go, right, how the hell is everybody? You know, what's going on? Let's chat about what we're doing today and how are people feeling. So use your resources of your colleagues and your co-workers to support each other. Even just as the day is going along, sending a quick text, sending a quick email, going over to somebody that's not looking right. Use your support from each other. We've all been through this experience together, and then we're all back at work together. So you need to rely on each other to go, I'm just feeling a bit strange today. You know, there's certainly something going around where people are almost having sort of COVID shocks. It's like a sudden realization of, you know, how awful it's been, and some people can obviously get teary because it's so overwhelming. So look out for those people and look out for yourself and get support from your colleagues because they are the ones going through that. I agree with Annie, risk assessments absolutely essential. Those should be going round before you go back to work and covering physical and mental health, and you should be getting all the information of the kinds of support that your employer provides anyway. Yeah, use each other as a resource, check up on each other. Don't feel that you shouldn't be doing that, because that's exactly what you should be doing, is going to people, how are you doing today? How's this morning been? How many emails have you got? What's going on? And support each other. If you can create those little times, those more formal times at lunchtime or beginning of the day, that's fantastic. But don't think I just need to carry on with this and pretend that everything's back to normal, because things are not back to normal. Nothing is back to normal. So it is completely appropriate to be feeling overwhelmed, and therefore you need to give each other support.
Thanks for that, James. We've had quite a few questions posted about the increase in anxiety amongst people related to COVID directly, but also perhaps related to the after effects of COVID-19 with changes in employment, possible redundancies, the job market, and the future, really. So there's a question here that kind of summarises a lot of the questions that have been posted, saying that anxiety post-COVID won't just be related to the immediate impact that it's had on people's lives, but many people will be anxious over the future for themselves and their families regarding employment, poverty, and fear that the feeling that normality for life is indefinitely blighted. So have you got any comments really about whether anxiety is going to be a much more common occurrence, a much more daily thing for people who perhaps didn't have these feelings pre-March?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we probably can all expect that this situation has been really anxiety inducing for a lot of us, and will continue to be as there are kind of further economic repercussions. I think it's just and I think a lot of people have been talking about the experience having kind of a almost PTSD style symptoms as well, of kind of like being like going through the experience of crisis, like an expectation that some of the like hardest things possibly won't hit until later as well. So I think that's why it's extra important to, I guess, be vigilant about any kind of symptoms you might have, or symptoms in friends and family. I think we're all, you know, like aware that that precarious situation will, of course, have a huge impact in our mental health. So it is about getting that signposting out there. There's so many great resources people have been putting in the chat, so that, you know, if these things happen, we feel we've got places to go. We feel like we're prepared. We feel that there are people in our corner if we need to, if we're having a difficult experience with our employer, or a difficult experience with our landlord or whoever. So yeah, very much agreed that it's you know, we can expect an increase in these things, and hopefully we can try and be as proactive about that as possible to kind of minimize harm as best we can for the future.
Thanks, Annie. Before I post that same question to James, there's someone has posted in the Q&A box, asked if there will be a list of resources posted after the session that have been shared. I believe that's what you're going to be doing, Jane. Perhaps you can confirm anything that's been shared in the chat panel you'll be sending out to anyone registered. There is also a question about, does the TUC have a risk assessment checklist template? We've got a piece of short micro learning, which is about how reps can work with their employers on risk assessments, and perhaps someone can post that in the chat in a minute. If not, I'll dig it out as well. But that same question to James about the increase in anxiety, and it might become a daily occurrence for more people now than it did a few months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I've no doubt that anxiety is going to be much higher, and I actually kind of think that we need to be doing something about that now. So we need to be addressing it now, and asking your employers if they can put on sessions about stress awareness and stress techniques, but also take that responsibility for ourselves and look at the different ways that you manage your own anxiety, and do it now, because the anxiety is out there, and when we start getting back to work, it is only going to increase because the world has changed so much. So, you know, I'm back in my job, and it is a completely different world that I've entered when I left. And I work in a library. This isn't high stress stuff, but it's chaos. It's absolute chaos. So I've had to try and build in those sort of stress management, those anxiety management techniques now. So I sort of ensure that I go for a ride, and I go for a cycle, and I spend some time out in the countryside if I can. But we need to do it now, because as we start to get back to work, you know, those stress is going to build and build and build and build. And then you've got the whole kind of infrastructure of the world, you know, the economy and how that's kicked on. The stresses are only going to continue. You know, it isn't that we're going to go back to work and everything has gone back to normal. Far from it. We're going to be in for a huge shock about, you know, whether we've still got jobs or what the company's doing, etc. So build in those techniques now, try things now. So, you know, you can simply Google, you know, anxiety management techniques, have a look through. There's fantastic books about anxiety that you can read. Loads of them on the Reading Well scheme. And just to help Annie there. But I would say do it now. So look at now and try things now. So try mindfulness, try meditation, try going out for a walk, try, you know, exercise, whatever it might be, try crocheting, try knitting, whatever it might be to help your anxiety. And if you put those places in now, then that's going to help, because anxiety management is like any other muscle, that the more you practice it, when that thing comes along, you know, if we don't do anything about it now, and suddenly we're met with huge amounts of anxiety when we go back to work, then it's much more difficult to tackle. So I would say start now, look at those techniques that might work for you, start practicing, see the ones that work, and then when the anxiety and stress does come along, hopefully you'll be more equipped to manage it.
Thanks, James. We've had a question posted about whether these webinars are going to continue, and perhaps in an early evening time slot. I mean, the TUC and Union Learn have a program of webinars that is approximately once a week. From the TUC, the broader TUC side of webinars, we do have webinars over the next 3 weeks or so. The Union Learn also, you can see underneath the screen here, there's a green button which will take you to a registration page for the next Union Learn webinar, which is on laughter yoga. I think it's the second time it's been run, possibly the third, but definitely not the first. Really popular and I think really effective. So do sign up for that. You can see all of the webinars that are scheduled by going to the TUC's webinar homepage, which is this website, crowdcast.io/TUC, and you can see everything that's coming up. We might be having a couple of weeks break in August just because it's pretty intense doing them every week, but they're definitely not stopping. Please don't worry. We think they've been a really useful resource. Well, they've always been useful, but particularly useful over the last 4 months. So please don't worry, they won't be stopping. Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question before we sum up. So let me see. We've perhaps covered some of this before, but we've got here a question about how to best broach the subject with people, and perhaps it's about, just how you broach it with everyone, that just because lockdown has eased doesn't mean the impact from depression or anxiety will suddenly disappear. I know we've covered some of these points already, but perhaps we can focus on that a little bit more. Annie, over to you.
In terms of like starting conversations about in the workplace, about I think having like building it into the sort of structure of how you work as an organization is the most important thing, because you're right, like people who are feeling more vulnerable are often like feel less likely to be the ones to broach this topic. So it might be, if you're feeling like reasonably fine for now, it's kind of worth talking to your employers about, to safeguard your own potential future mental health impact, but also for that of your colleagues, because your colleagues' mental health challenges may also challenge you, both kind of like personally and professionally. And I think it takes the impetus off the individual if it's part of a kind of company strategy, just as you might have your kind of like targets for the year for your work. I think having organizational targets for wellbeing support, whether that's, I think there's been some chat about like peer support networks, they can be really useful. Setting up a time for everyone to share, setting up, access to like resources. I think Mental Health Foundation, I think it may have been posted, have lots of great resources about managing your mental health, working from home and going into work. And I think that sharing those with your employer, even just like via email, but via kind of like all staff email, asking your HR representative to share them with everyone, then everyone has them and it's seen as like a collective responsibility rather than just the responsibility of people who might be struggling at a particular point to advocate for themselves. And just, I guess trying as best you can to kind of hold your employers to account if those resources aren't shared, and kind of seeing it as you're a kind of just a good collegiate thing to do to kind of continue to keep that stream going as much as is possible.
Thanks, Annie. James, have you got any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, definitely. I certainly agree with what Annie's saying. I think, you know, at times of great stress, it can be really difficult to say to your boss, I need help. So actually, kind of what we often need is other colleagues to push the mental health support that's there for you. So we need, you know, those people to go, well, actually, can we have, you know, emotional well-being targets? Can we have a built-in discussion during support sessions? You know, can we have posters that are clearly around the room about mental health? So I feel that I can bring up that topic. So if mental health isn't, you know, advertised in inverted commas, then we're much less likely to talk about it. So if you don't have things up on the notice board around mental health, then you're going to think, well, actually, can I talk about this? Is this okay to talk about? I don't know. You know, the company, the organization has to be saying as a clear message, yes, we can talk about this. This is okay to talk about. And if that isn't coming your way, you need the people that aren't unwell at the time to push for that, to push for the people who are maybe not so well. Because trying to talk about mental health stuff when you're not well is incredibly hard. And normally it gets spotted by behavior. But actually what we need is the employer to go, I have noticed that you're not doing so great. Can we talk about that? Or, you know, something coming around, and emails constantly coming around going, check your mental health. And that is even, we need to be doubling and tripling that when we go back to work. We really do. So there needs to be a push from employers. So people that are doing okay, if you can advocate for those people that aren't, or maybe aren't in the future, and say what we would really like is, you know, a informal support session, some more webinars, some more support services, some time built into supervision about how we're doing, an easier way to talk about that. So we have to develop conversations, and especially employers and managers have to develop conversations in language that make it accessible for people with mental health to talk about. Because if we go, how are you doing? Then, you know, the answer is usually, well, I'm fine. So we have to be much more detailed about that. We have to kind of go, tell me about your emotional health. Are you having any ups and downs? So we have to introduce those topics and those language very clearly. It's not enough to go, well, we have a policy about it. It's fine. You know, there's a paragraph in the mental well-being policy, and it's down. It's right at the bottom, but it's definitely there. Just not good enough. Just not good enough. You have to push. Those of us that have to push, and then we have to create those conversations where it becomes much more accessible and easier to say, I'm not okay, and know that the repercussions of that are not going to be serious. So what's great for employers to do is to build up in general conversations around the workplace, around mental health. So you might go, did you see the program last night about EastEnders when the person with, you know, the mental health problem? And having informal conversations about that is really good, because it means, oh, so my boss is understanding about that, and I can see they're not going to judge me around about that, and I'm not immediately going to get sacked around that. So there are informal things and formal things to do, but it has to be brought out into the workplace, not hidden in a policy and as a tick box exercise. And that's really important to push for.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think that's a really key takeaway. I'm just about to bring you back on the screen as well. There we go. So really important takeaway there is to make it acceptable and okay to talk about, really. I think that's as if it's an everyday conversation, then of course it's much easier for people to broach their worries and their concerns. I think it's been really interesting to see as well in the chat what some unions have been doing to help support their members with mental health over this past 4 months. So time has sped by because it's all been so interesting, and almost time for us to go. So I'm just going to ask Annie and then ask James just to sum up, just like last few words before we go. So Annie, over to you.
I guess, yeah, keep talking to your employer, keep the conversation going, and keep on top of your mental health and the mental health of your colleagues as you would your physical health. There's been some great resources in the chat that will be circulated, so hopefully there's some things that can provide a real tangible shift and change to support people in the coming months.
Cheers, Annie. Just final words from you, James?
I think the one thing that holds us back talking about our mental health is shame. So shame is the barrier. So if we can look at why we're feeling ashamed, and if we get messages from employers, it's nothing to be ashamed about. We all experience mental health, and some of us experience mental illness. So the first thing that we have to do is tackle our own shame-based stuff, because a lot of the time we feel bad about that. And also we need examples from employers. So if you feel like not talking up about your mental health, that is not your fault. That is because what society has produced in terms of how we look at mental health. So please do not feel ashamed to talk about your mental health. And if you're not getting the support that you believe you should be getting, non-judgmental, supportive, flexible, understanding, then please take that further, because mental health is so important to get right, get supported. So please don't back down. Sometimes you have to push when you don't feel like you want to push, but it's too important not to.
Thanks, James. And so all that remains for me to do is to thank you all for tuning in today. You've been brilliant. Thank you to Annie, thank you to James, and thank you to Jane and Louisa, who've been answering questions and posting links and resources in the chat. So do sign up for the next webinar. Like I said, there's a button underneath us, and we'll see you all again soon. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye for now.